After the election, so I have to admit that the discussions about what will happen to Ukraine, they have just speed up, they have skyrocketed. First and foremost, because of two questions. The first one is what's about long-lasting military support to Ukraine, because unfortunately Ukraine has won for all its partners and for European partners in particular almost 3 years of the war in terms of giving the time to prepare the defense and military industries and domains to get prepared for possible consequences in case Russia conventionally or hybridly someone will try to undermine the security of the European continent, or to prepare for the situation which is pretty possible right now, that US will step away from being the main military donor of Ukraine. This, of course, is a big challenge because Europe generally is not prepared to take this role yet. However, is pretty frightened by the fact that they will have to do something because the Russia's pushes on Ukraine, and in case Ukraine falls down or the front line is collapsed, so the first who will feel this effect will not be US, will be European countries, European neighbors of Ukraine. The second issue, which is make Ukrainian discussion about possible consequences of Trump election, is of course negotiations. I can't say so. Ed has mentioned that since 2014 I'm dealing with wartime diplomacy in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in particular in Donbass, and I understand pretty well that the logic of Russia right now, and with this enormous increase of the warfare, especially air attacks, and not only air attacks but pushes underground in Donbass in particular, and in Zaporizhia region, this is really the preparation of Russia for negotiations. This is the best evidence to me because this is the long-lasting tactics and strategy of Russia to increase the pushes underground in order to corner basically your vis-a-vis to be weaker and to corner your vis-a-vis to sit down at the table. Couple of words from Ukrainian perspective here. This is not a piece of news that Ukraine will be asked to think a lot about possibly negotiated deal with Russia. These discussions publicly and unpublicly, they are circulating for at least 1 year since our partners in the West were more than even Ukraine dissatisfied with very modest results of 2023 counteroffensive of Ukraine. And the consequence, the direct political consequence last year was to start thinking about what's about the possible deal. However, the problem is that Ukraine needs and wants, not only just from its own perspective, but from European or regional security perspective, wants some guarantees that this deal will bring predictability and sustainability of at least, even not peace, but at least ceasefire. If this ceasefire is just a political declaration without any guarantees, any monitoring mission, any boots on the ground, not even along the front line, but for instance, at least along the northern and northeast border of Ukraine with Belarus and Russia, where Ukraine is still keeping enormous number of Ukrainian soldiers who cannot just leave this line in order to support their compatriots on the real front line inside the country. So if we don't have all these conditions, then the ceasefire will be no more than a game. Ukraine will be dragged into, the direct consequence of which most probably will be significant decrease of Western help, because the logic of Western partners of Ukraine, in contrary to Russia, and this is one of the main challenges for Ukraine now. If we're starting negotiations about anything, we start doing anything that can potentially provoke so-called escalation. While Russia, when start negotiations or preparing to negotiations, doing completely the opposite. They're doubling down on their military production, they're doubling down on their warfare activity on the ground, and we already see this disbalance on the ground. And I'm afraid that we are not yet at the moment when US, under Trump, and unfortunately Ukraine influenced or impacted by Trump re-election will be in a strong position during these negotiations. However, there is no expectations that huge political deal will be in place. So that's why Ukraine, while understanding all these challenges, has done very wise step recently. And in my opinion, will be doing this even more actively. Ukraine is extremely actively trying to increase local military production, which is of vital importance. And you can see it even from official, open information, what even to say about non-public discussions about that Ukraine is not asking for that much delivery of military aid to Ukraine now, rather than is asking recently for helping to increase local production, to set up new local enterprises, to invest, and of course to secure Ukraine with air defense, because no local production, even in the very west of Ukraine, is possible without good air defense. For instance, today there is another piece of news from Ukraine that for the first time Russia supposedly has struck an intercontinental ballistic missile on Ukraine with not nuclear warhead, with a conventional warhead. But still, this is another sign that here Ukraine needs not keeping the same level of military aid, especially air defense missiles to be delivered to Ukraine, but even increase of that. This can partially substitute the lack or potential lack of other types of the weapons being sent to Ukraine after Trump in the office. And the last but not least here is about the connection between this, let's say, attempts of Trump supposedly to set up some kind of a deal, most probably just about the ceasefire, nothing else, and domestic situation in Ukraine. President Zelensky, from political and maybe from personal perspective, won't be able to sign anything or even to declare anything stating that Ukraine actually agrees to de facto situation when part of the Ukrainian territory is occupied. This is not possible at all. The second important point here is President Zelensky and no one in power now in Ukraine won't be able to agree that Ukraine will refrain from its EU or NATO membership aspirations, partially because of huge demand from inside the country to receive this, not membership perspective, but membership itself, both in European Union and NATO, but also because this will prove that Ukraine's rights for political sovereign decisions are being impacted by negotiations between US and Russia, and politically this is not bearable for President Zelensky. He will not do that. And the third point here, direct negotiations are hardly possible between Ukraine and Russia. That's why I do see the space probably with indirect negotiations stating some kind of declaration about possible ceasefire, but without direct signing of the documents. We have had already a very close example of that, like back in 2022 with grain deal. Then we have another track of negotiations about returning to Ukraine deported kids with the mediation of Qatar. And we have had another track which unfortunately has failed so far about refraining from strikes on energy infrastructure both inside Ukraine and Russia. These negotiations have failed, but these are just the schemes, the only one format which is possible at this very moment, in my opinion. The problem for Ukraine with the Trump is that there is an expectation that as soon as, let's imagine, Trump forces or enforces this kind of deal about possible ceasefire or temporary ceasefire, Trump will get disinterested in Ukraine and Russia's war the very next second, and then the real problem will appear for Ukraine. Politically, it means that Ukraine will not be on agenda for new administration, and they will divert their attention from Ukraine to some other regions, including Middle East. The military aid will drop again, even to a greater extent than we expect now. For this reason, I do think we have a huge challenge, even if Trump will succeed with supposedly his initiative about ceasefire. But speaking practically on the basis of my analysis of Russia waging war on Ukraine hybridly or conventionally since 2014, I do not see, unfortunately, any evidence for the ceasefire, even if there is a declaration about that, to be sustainable. I do think Russia is trying to start this game right now exactly to step into the negotiations before the position of Russia is weaker than it is now. They want to do it in advance, to have a huge gap between the capacities of Ukraine while negotiations are being held and the capacities of Russia, which are stronger at this very moment. And then in, I don't know, 3 to 6 months, possibly 1 year, which will be the pause favorable for Russia's domestic restoration of its capacities, Russia will try to attack again. So we are not speaking about not only a political deal, we're not speaking about any perspective of the end of this war, unfortunately. Even with Trump being, for a short-term perspective, very interested in getting some kind of success here. From Ukrainian perspective, the main problem of our European partners is lack of political leadership or willingness to be politically ahead of all the support of Ukraine and ahead of strategy towards Russia. And it's not mainly about the US being a main military donor to Ukraine, but rather US being for 2.5 or more, almost 3 years already, like a leader of this pro-Ukrainian coalition in this war. And I think that's the main problem, that's the main obstacle. Even now, when I speak to colleagues who are working on the continent, they always insist that, oh, if there is a problem with establishing a good, fruitful cooperation on defense and security issues in Europe with Trump administration, we need UK back, we need UK in. What for do you need UK exactly? For political leadership, not for defense industry of UK. Rather for somebody to govern all this bunch of countries, supposedly with the same approach, different one, but the same approach that Ukraine should survive and should sustain. But at the same time, there is a refrain from being, very visible. I think Germany is a good example of a country who was investing, at least until recently, a lot in comparison to what was expected from Germany. But at the same time, the political strategy within this pro-Ukrainian coalition for Germany was to stay in the shadow of political leadership of US, UK, even France, not to be considered neither by Russia nor by someone else as the great and huge supporter of Ukraine on a financial or military level. One more comment here about what else European actors can do. I think from Ukrainian perspective, there is a clear understanding right now that there are serious, they are not catastrophic, but there are divisions, and they will sustain for some time. The divisions from security perspective, which countries are willing to do what, and what are horizon of possible cooperation with specific countries. Though Ukraine has signed almost 30 security agreements with different countries supporting Ukraine, and in most cases these agreements are very similar one to another, except for some specific details or non-public parts, but generally, still there is an understanding that despite the formal level of having the same security or similar security agreements with all those countries, there is a division between those who have the same approach towards Russia and towards supporting Ukraine, and those who have more modest, let's say, approach. From this point of view, UK, Poland, even Baltic states, which do not possess any defense capabilities comparable to those Ukraine can, work on with UK or with Poland, but still Nordic countries, Finland, even Sweden here is a good place. But So Ukraine, from its perspective, in my opinion, in the next 4 years, while Trump is in Washington, regardless of what Trump exactly will be doing, Ukraine will be doubling down on deepening relations with those countries where we see the perspective of being as close on security and defense terms as possible. And this is what we are observing now. However, of course, the position of US will influence and impact, and especially under Trump, these perspectives of this cooperation. I do think that the good example of how Washington impacts this is the air defense shield, the idea which Ukraine is trying to set up with at least Poland and Romania to persuade them to start shut down the air targets above Ukraine, at least above the critical infrastructure objects in the very west of Ukraine, and to prevent at least that part of Ukraine from being on a nightly and daily basis targeted by missiles and drones. But again, we do have more or less perspective position of Poland here, more accurate and more concerned approach on the side of Romania here, but we haven't had any political confirmation or even silent approval from US yet. And probably from this point of view, Warsaw and Washington relations under Trump will be more or less a new chance to go forward with this idea for Ukraine.